The minstrel's melody. Leo hauled the last suitcase up the 3 flights of rickety stairs, the back of his shirt plastered to his skin by the humid fist of New Orleans. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, garbage, and something ancient, the smell of history gracefully rotting. The attic apartment he'd rented, tucked away on a small cobblestone street in the French Quarter, was astonishingly cheap. The landlady, a Creole woman with sharp, black eyes named Evangeline, had just shrugged when he'd asked why. "It's got character," she'd said, which was not an answer. Character was one word for it. The paint peeled in long strips from the walls, revealing older layers of plaster beneath. The floorboards groaned under every footstep as if recounting decades of stories, and the single window looked out onto a brick wall draped in ivy. But it had high ceilings, enough space for his guitar, his amp, and his weary soul. He'd come to this city with less than $500 to his name and a dying dream of making it as a musician. This apartment, for all its flaws, felt like a sanctuary. The first night, the city came alive. The mournful wail of a saxophone from a street corner, the low rumble of laughter from a nearby bar, and the constant hum of humanity bounced off his thin walls. Leo sat on the floor, his old Gibson in his lap. He tried to write, to find a melody that could capture the swirling sense of hope and desperation inside him. But his fingers felt clumsy, and his mind was blank. That's when he heard it for the first time. It was just a few notes, thin as a spider's thread, seeming to drift in from the open window. An acoustic guitar melody, intricate and sad. It was Delta blues, but it had a sophistication he'd never heard before. He dismissed it as a street performer, one of the city's countless, nameless talents. He listened for a moment, captivated, before the melody dissolved into the symphony of the night. But it came again the next night, clearer this time, closer. It wasn't coming from outside the window. It felt like it was in the room with him. Leo put his own guitar down, straining to hear. The melody flowed, telling a wordless story of loss and longing. It was painfully beautiful. He went to the window, peering down into the dark alley below. No one. He pressed his ear to the walls, listening for his neighbors. Only silence. His curiosity began to curdle into unease. Every night, the music returned. It always started sometime after midnight. A ghostly solo played for an audience of one. It began to seep into his dreams, and when he woke, the tune would still be echoing in his head. He found himself unconsciously strumming fragments of it on his own guitar. The notes felt strangely familiar under his fingers. "Ms. Evangeline," he asked the following week, catching her sweeping the porch, "are there any other musicians living in this building?" She stopped, her dark eyes narrowing. "Just you, Cher." "Why?" "Oh, no reason," Leo said quickly. "I just thought I heard a guitar." Evangeline gave him a long, penetrating look. "A lot of things been heard in these walls," she said softly, before returning to her sweeping, the conversation over. Her cryptic reply only deepened Leo's disquiet. He started searching. At the public library, he scrolled through microfiche of old New Orleans newspapers, looking for any mention of his address. After hours of eye-straining work, he found it. A small clipping from 1957. "Blues musician found dead." The article was brief. A man named Silas Blackwood, 24 years old, discovered dead in his attic apartment. The cause of death was ruled an unfortunate accident, but there were whispers of an unpaid gambling debt and a jealous rival. The article was accompanied by a grainy, black and white photo of a young man with sorrowful eyes and long, elegant hands cradling an acoustic guitar. Leo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. It was his apartment. That night, the music returned with a vengeance. It was no longer a background melody. It was a presence. The air in the room grew cold. Leo sat frozen on his bed, his own guitar resting on its stand in the corner. He watched, in horror and awe, as one of the strings vibrated, then another, plucked by an invisible hand. Silas's melody filled the room, a full-bodied, haunting lament. Leo's fear began to give way to a different, stranger feeling, empathy. He was a musician. He understood the need to be heard. Silas wasn't trying to scare him. He was just trying to play. A few nights later, Leo was struggling with a song of his own, his fingers stiff and clumsy on the fretboard. Frustration was building in him like a fever. "I can't get it," he whispered to the empty room. Then a piercing cold enveloped his right hand. It wasn't an unpleasant feeling. It was like plunging your hand into a cool stream. He looked down, and in the dim light, he saw a faint, almost translucent shimmer surrounding his fingers. And then his hand moved. It moved with a grace and precision he had never possessed. His fingers flew across the fretboard, pulling Silas's melody from the strings. Not just the fragments he had heard, but the entire composition, complete with intricate transitions and soulful harmonies he'd never imagined. It wasn't him playing. He was the instrument and someone else was the player. A terrifying, exhilarating awe washed over him. The music poured out of him, a torrent of pent-up emotion. Silas's pain, his loves, the betrayal that had ended his life. Leo could feel it all, as if the memories were being mainlined directly into his soul. The music spoke of humid Louisiana nights, of the taste of cheap bourbon and the smile of a lost woman. It spoke of the thrill of creating something new and the sharp, bitter sting of having it stolen. He realized Silas didn't just want to play his old songs. There was one song, his masterpiece, left unfinished the night he died. That's what was keeping him here. Leo stopped fighting. He surrendered. "Okay, Silas," he whispered. "Let's finish it." For the next week, a strange ritual unfolded. Every night, Leo would sit with his guitar and wait. The cold would come and he would become a conduit. He set up an old microphone and a tape recorder, capturing everything. Night after night, they built the song together, layer upon layer. Leo would play a part, and then Silas, through his hands, would answer, adding a complexity or a countermelody Leo would never have conceived. It was a collaboration across the veil of death. Finally, one night just before dawn, it was done. They played it from start to finish one last time. It was nearly 10 minutes long, an epic of tragedy and hope. As the final note hung in the air and faded to silence, the room warmed. The cold on Leo's hand receded. For a fleeting moment, he saw him. Silas Blackwood was standing in the corner, no longer a shimmering presence, but almost solid. He was dressed in the clothes of the 50s, his sorrowful eyes now peaceful. He gave Leo a single nod, a simple gesture of gratitude, before dissolving like smoke in the first light of morning. Leo sat there, exhausted and trembling, until the sun was fully up. The presence was gone. The room was just a room, its walls silent for the first time in weeks. He took the recording, which he titled simply Silas's Minuet, to a small local blues producer. The man, an elderly connoisseur, listened in silence, his eyes closed. When it was over, he opened them, and there were tears in them. "My God, son," he breathed. "Where did you find this?" Leo told him the whole story. He expected disbelief, ridicule. Instead, the producer just nodded slowly. "This is New Orleans," he said, as if that explained everything. Some songs never really die. Leo didn't become a star overnight, but Silas's Minuet was released. It was hailed by critics as a lost masterpiece, a perfect marriage of technical brilliance and raw emotion. Leo's name was on it as the performer and arranger, but he always made sure Silas Blackwood's name was bigger. He never moved out of the attic apartment. It had become a sanctuary. Sometimes, on quiet nights when he was writing, he would feel a fleeting familiarity in the air, a whisper of encouragement in the silence. He was no longer alone in his music. He had found his own voice by lending his hands to a lost soul, and in the process, created something more timeless than either of the call from the old mine. For Clara, the Appalachian Mountains in autumn were the closest thing to heaven. The air was crisp, biting at her cheeks with a playful chill, and a tapestry of gold, orange, and crimson stretched to the horizon. She had been hiking these trails since she was a child, taught by her father how to read the trail markers, how to distinguish the cry of a red-tailed hawk from a buzzard, and how to respect the profound silence of these ancient mountains. That silence was what she sought today, an antidote to the ceaseless noise of city life. She was about 3 hours deep into a less-trafficked section of the trail. Her only companions were the rustle of the wind in the canopy, the crunch of dry leaves under her boots, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. The solitude was glorious. That's when she heard it for the first time. A whistle, a single, high, clear note that hung in the air and then vanished. It was so distant that she almost convinced herself it was a bird or a trick of the wind. But the note had a perfect quality to it, a pure tone that no bird she knew could produce. She stopped, tilting her head to listen. Nothing. Shrugging, she continued on. 10 minutes later, it came again. Not one note this time, but a short, 4-note phrase repeated twice. It was still distant, but the melody was strange, at once as simple as a nursery rhyme and indescribably complex. It seemed to weave its way through the trees, beckoning. Against her better judgment, Clara found herself smiling. Perhaps another hiker was nearby, someone with a cheerful soul. She kept walking, but now a part of her mind was on alert, waiting. The melody came again, a little closer this time. It had a bizarre quality. She couldn't pinpoint the direction it was coming from. It seemed to be everywhere at once. Her curiosity began to win out over her caution. The trail veered to the left, winding up a ridge, but the whistling seemed to be coming from a more direct path, through the dense woods to her right. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding surprisingly small among the towering trunks. There was no answer, just the tune repeating, for haunting notes. An internal debate began. Her father had taught her to never, ever leave the trail. It was the #1 rule. But the tune, it pulled at her. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like a sensation, a vibration in the air that promised something worth seeing, a secret meant only for her. She told herself she would only go a short way, just far enough to see who was making that strange music. Stepping off the marked path was like stepping into another world. The canopy was thicker here, the sunlight muted, and the ground soft and uneven. She had to pick her way carefully over gnarled roots and moss-covered rocks. The whistling was her only guide now, growing louder, then softer, leading her on a meandering path deeper into the wilderness. Her initial sense of excitement began to fade, replaced by a creeping feeling of anxiety. The woods seemed too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the whistle and the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. After what felt like 20 minutes of walking, she stepped into a clearing, and there she saw it. Set against the side of the hill were the ruins of an old coal mine. Rotted wooden beams and rusted pieces of metal littered the ground. The main entrance to the mine was sealed with thick timbers and boards, nailed shut decades ago. A weathered, almost unreadable metal sign warned of danger and toxic gas. The place radiated a sense of abandonment and decay, and the whistling was coming from inside it. Clara stood frozen. It was so close now, so clear, as if the whistler were standing just behind the sealed planks. The simple 4-note tune had now morphed into a more complex symphony, mournful and longing. A cold dread trickled down her spine, despite the afternoon sun. This made no sense. No one could be in there. Then the sound changed. The whistling stopped. A heavy silence fell over the clearing. "Mommy!" The voice was small, trembling, and it came from behind the boards. It was the voice of a little child. Clara felt the blood freeze in her veins. "Is someone there?" she called back, her own voice shaking. "Are you okay?" I'm lost, the child's voice said, a sob catching in it. Please help me. It's so dark. Panic and compassion warred within Clara. A child trapped in an abandoned mine? She rushed forward to the sealed entrance, pulling at the boards. They were solid, held fast by rusted nails. Don't worry, she yelled. I'll get you out. What's your name? There was a pause. I don't remember, the voice whispered. It's so cold in here, Mommy. That word again, Mommy, piercing her like a shard of ice. She wasn't anyone's mother. A cold logic began to cut through her panic. How could a child have gotten into a mine that had been sealed for years? And why did the voice, though clear, have a strange, echoing quality, as if it were being spoken by something that was only trying to imitate human speech? She took a step back from the entrance. How did you get in there? Silence. Then, a low chuckle, no longer childlike, but a dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves. We didn't get in, it whispered, the voice now multi-toned, a bizarre fusion of the child and the hoarse rasp of an old man. We've always been here, and we are so hungry. The horror hit Clara with the force of a physical blow, a wave of ice that paralyzed her. This wasn't a child. This wasn't human. The whistling, the voice, it was all a lure. The thing in the darkness had mimicked the sounds it knew would draw a person in. A curious melody, a desperate plea for help. She turned and ran. An inhuman screech of fury erupted from behind the boards, a sound of raw, primal frustration. A frantic scratching began, the sound of rotting wood being torn apart. Clara didn't dare look back. She crashed through the forest, no longer caring about roots or rocks. Branches whipped at her face and arms, but she didn't feel the pain. There was only pure, unadulterated terror. Behind her, the sounds changed again. It mimicked her father's voice. Clara, wait! You're going the wrong way. She stumbled, falling hard, the wind knocked out of her. For one insane second, she almost believed it. Don't leave me, honey, the voice pleaded, and it was a perfect imitation, full of warmth and concern. But her father had been dead for 5 years. The grief and horror of that thought propelled her to her feet. She ran faster than she ever had in her life, hot tears streaming down her cheeks. The voice behind her dissolved, shifting into a terrible medley of sounds. Animal snarls, the shattering of glass, the screams of people it had heard and catalogued over the centuries. Finally, she stumbled out of the woods and back onto the trail. She didn't stop. She ran until her legs felt like they would buckle, until the mine and its clearing were a distant, nightmarish memory. By the time she reached her car, the sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains in hues of blood and bruises. Clara never hiked alone again. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind picks up, she thinks she can hear it. A distant fragment of a melody, for ghostly notes searching, calling in the dark. And she knows that there are things in those ancient mountains, older than the trees, that wait patiently, learning and mimicking the sounds that will lead you off the path. The night watchman at St. Jude's. Arthur Finch was a practical man. He believed in mortgages, utility bills, and the bitter taste of cheap coffee at 3 a.m. He did not believe in ghosts. So when he took the job as the night watchman at the shuttered St. Jude's Asylum, he considered it a stroke of luck. 12 hours of well-paid boredom with only rats and memories for company. The building was a Victorian monstrosity, a sprawling Gothic hulk of dark red brick slowly decaying in the English countryside. Its barred windows were like vacant eyes, staring out over the overgrown grounds. The day guard, a weary old man named George, handed Arthur a heavy brass key ring. "She has her echoes," George had said, his eyes hollowed out by sleepless nights. "Just don't listen too closely." Arthur had grunted, assuming it was an old man's poetic way of describing the creaks and groans of an old building. The first few hours proved him right. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps echoing on the linoleum floors and the jangling of the old keys. He patrolled the cavernous, long corridors, the beam of his flashlight playing over peeling paint and doors with small wire mesh windows. The air was heavy with the smell of old antiseptic, dust, and an unspeakable sadness. He started in the children's wing. Faded, peeling murals of cartoon animals smiled grotesquely from the walls. In the middle of the hall, a lone wooden rocking horse lay on its side. As Arthur shone his light on it, he thought he heard a faint, almost inaudible sob from one of the empty wards. He stopped, straining his ears. Only silence. The wind, he told himself. Next was the hydrotherapy ward, a cold, clinical room of floor-to-ceiling white tile. The massive porcelain tubs looked like open coffins. As he stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. Arthur shivered, his breath fogging in the air. He heard another sound, a soft splash, followed by a terrified, watery gasp. He spun around, flashing his light into every dark corner. The room was empty and bone-dry, but the feeling of a terrible event, a memory soaked into the very tiles, lingered, cold and damp. Arthur's skepticism began to fracture. These weren't the noises of an old building. These were sounds with intent, fragments of tragedy. By the time he reached the maximum security wing on the west side of the building, his unease had curdled into genuine fear. This part of the asylum was darker, more oppressive. It was here he saw his first figure. Just a fleeting shadow at the far end of the hall, the shape of a man in hospital pajamas, his back hunched in a posture of utter defeat. "Hey!" Arthur yelled, his voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. He ran forward, his flashlight beam dancing manically. When he reached the corner, the hallway was empty. A thick, undisturbed layer of dust coated the floor. No one could have walked here without leaving tracks. He began to walk faster, eager to get back to the relative safety of the security office. But the building seemed to be toying with him now. The sounds grew more frequent. The squeak of a gurney wheel from an empty corridor, a muffled scream from behind a closed door, a disjointed lullaby echoing from the children's wing. They were the echoes George had warned of, sonic scars left behind by decades of misery. It was then he heard a voice. Unlike the other fragmented sounds, this was clear and calm. A low, educated male voice, speaking with a cold, clinical patience. And with the proper application of current, we can excise these undesirable hysterias. The voice seemed to be coming from the surgical wing, a section George had told him to avoid. Compelled by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, Arthur followed the sound. He came to a set of swinging doors with grimy glass windows. Inside was the old operating theater. Through the smeared glass, he saw a scene that should have been impossible. The room was illuminated by a cold, sourceless white light. A tall, thin figure in an old-fashioned doctor's coat stood with his back to him. He wasn't a transparent phantom. He looked completely solid. On the rusted operating table in the center of the room, another shape lay, a shimmering, trembling figure that seemed to be made of static. The doctor spoke again, his voice echoing unnaturally in the silent space. "Do not be alarmed. This will make you well." He reached for an instrument from the metal tray beside him, something that looked like an ice pick with wires attached. As the doctor turned his head slightly, Arthur saw his profile. It was a thin, severe face with deep-set eyes and a cruel, thin-lipped smile. It was a face devoid of compassion. Pure, undiluted horror washed over Arthur. This was not just a memory. This was a presence, an agent of suffering still at his ghastly work. Suddenly, all the lights in the wing died, plunging him into absolute blackness. His flashlight flickered and went out. He stood there, heart hammering in his chest, blinded by the dark. He heard a metallic clink from inside the theater, the sound of an instrument being dropped on the tiled floor. He fumbled with his flashlight, his hands shaking, banging it against his palm. It flickered back to life. He shone the trembling beam into the operating theater. It was empty. The strange light was gone. The operating table was bare. The room was silent once more. Arthur was done with his patrol. He turned and fled, his heavy footsteps the only sound in the darkness. He ran without stopping until he was back in the security office in the main hall, slamming the heavy door and locking it. He sat down in front of the bank of security monitors, all of which showed only gray, buzzing static. His breathing slowly returned to normal. Maybe he'd been in here too long. Maybe his mind was playing tricks. Then one of the monitors flickered. It wasn't static anymore. It showed a grainy, black and white image of the hallway outside the surgical wing. And walking down that hallway, directly toward the camera, was the doctor. He moved with a calm, deliberate purpose. Another monitor switched on, the hydrotherapy ward, where invisible ripples disturbed the surface of water in a waterless tub. Then another, the children's wing, where the rocking horse was now swaying back and forth on its own. The echoes were no longer confined to their sections. They were converging. Arthur stared, horrified, as the doctor's figure grew larger on the screen, passing through corridor after corridor, getting closer to his office. He could hear his footsteps now, not on the monitor, but just down the hall. The sobbing, the screams, the splashing, they all began at once. A mad chorus of suffering that surrounded his small office, pressing in on him. The doorknob began to rattle, gently at first, then violently. Arthur scrambled back from the door, tripping over his chair. Through the reinforced glass in the door, he could see a dark shape standing there, the tall, thin silhouette of the doctor blocking the dim light of the hall. He was trapped. The screaming grew louder, piercing the walls, piercing his head. The door shook on its hinges. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, mumbling a long-forgotten prayer, waiting for the inevitable end. And then, just as suddenly, it all stopped. The silence was as abrupt and final as a blade. The screaming vanished. The rattling ceased. Arthur opened his eyes. Through the window, the hall was empty. On the monitors, only quiet static. The faint, gray light of dawn was filtering through the high windows of the main hall. The night was over. When George arrived to relieve him, he found Arthur sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, shivering uncontrollably. "They're not real, son," George said gently, his voice full of weary understanding. "They can't hurt you. St. Jude's isn't haunted. Scarred. Like an old photograph, the place holds images of the bad things that happened. They're just echoes, playing over and over." Arthur got to his feet, still shaking. He placed the heavy key ring on the desk. "I quit." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked out of the main hall and into the crisp morning air. As he reached the gates, he couldn't resist one last look back at the monolithic building. And there, in a third-story window, the window of the operating theater, he saw a figure. A thin, gaunt face was looking down at him, its eyes just dark pits in the morning light. It was watching him. Arthur turned and walked faster. Maybe George was wrong. Maybe some echoes, after a while, learned to listen back.